to the same place. And we're all going to end up in heaven. I know a guy who was a minister, or is a minister. I think a guy that my brother knows, he graduated from high school with him. And he'll get up and preach a funeral, and he'll say, I don't believe that any God of love would ever condemn one of his children to hell. I believe the God of love will receive every one of his children one day. And but not everyone can be regarded as God's son. Only those that have been born again are scripturally regarded as God's sons or daughters, respectively. And yet, he says, I believe with every fiber of my being that this is how it is. He's got this little speech in there. But, you know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But he says, I don't believe that God of love, an infinite God, infinite love, an infinite world, would ever deny any of his children home in heaven when the time comes to come. It has nothing to do with the God of love. It has to do with, have you received the means by which God will save you? That is the death of Jesus Christ. You haven't, you're not saved. You have, you are saved. You haven't, you're not saved. You have, you are saved. But that's what it comes down to. I don't know why it's amazing how complex and complicated the rest of the world thinks they have to make salvation and reconciliation with God and forgiveness by God. It is by Jesus Christ. You know, I said this in, I think it was last week, or it might have been one of our Wednesday night Bible study. You know, if you go up to your neighbor, some guy at work, and you shoot and murder them, it's a serious crime. You have serious consequences to face. But if you murder a high-profile politician, governor, or police officer, the result of the crime is the same, right? The effect of what your actions are the same. But the penalty is going to be greater. Why? Because the crime was any worse? No. The penalty is greater because of the stature of the person who you murdered. They have a greater stature, and therefore you take their life. The punishment falling on you becomes more severe. It's like murdering a cop. The punishment's going to be added and become greater, not because of the severity of the crime, but because of the stature of the person you murdered. Their stature dictates how much punishment you're going to get. How severe do you think the punishment is going to be on a sinner that refuses the eternal, infinite Son of God, God in human form, the deity who made all of reality, who spoke and existence came into being, and the universe came into being, became a man and lived among men, and then suffered as a sacrifice, a substitute for that man. And the guy says, I don't need that. How much more severe do you think the punishment is going to be on someone who refuses Jesus Christ? Now the cults, they'll say, well, I think it's kind of mean that, go to hell just because I don't agree with you, I'm going to go to hell. It has nothing to do with whether you agree with me. Are you refusing the eternal Son of God? When you grasp a hold of how infinite and glorious Jesus Christ is, there aren't words to describe it, then you'll understand why nothing less than eternal punishment is adequate to punish that kind of sin. All right, verse 13 of our text, in the lips of him that hath understanding, wisdom is found. But a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. There's a contrast between a man or a son that has understanding and someone who does not. And the rod is what's called the rod of correction, later on in Proverbs 22. For the back of the rod of correction shall drive foolishness far from the son. Verse 14, he says, wise men lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. Again, there's a contrast presented between a wise man and a fool. And just like the prating fool back in verse 8, who is causing more trouble for himself by shooting his mouth off and boasting of himself and bragging about himself. You know, I've been working, my secular job is in a funeral home. I've been working there for several years now. And I've never heard of anybody dying who was a bad person. I never have. Everybody was a saint. Everybody's in heaven. One guy, I mentioned this once before, he was a Johnny Cash fan. And so at his funeral they were playing I Fell Into a Burning Ring of Fire, and I went down, down, down. Well, that's as close as you get to talking about going into flames at the funeral. But basically everybody goes to heaven. Everyone's grandma was a saint. Everyone's teenage kid was a saint. It doesn't matter, he got shot and then drugged by, and he's all tatted up from his time in prison. No, he was on his way to Bible class, and somebody came by, and that's basically the idea they have. Everyone went to heaven. Everybody was a saint. Hell must be empty because nobody, judging from the funerals, nobody's ever gone there. And it's all based upon how good people thought they were. And nobody wants to say something bad about the person, so they make up a lie. There's one guy who's a Catholic deacon, and when he comes to officiate a funeral, he'll say, I didn't know your sister, so I'm gonna need your help. I want to go around the room and anyone, I want you to shout out with one word, some word that describes her. Just one word. They go around the room: loving, kind, helpful, thankful, gracious, polite, well-mannered, and he goes around all the room and he collects all these words. And he says, interesting, all of those words could be used to describe Jesus. And he tries to make some connection that just by the fact that she has all these nice things said about her, that prove that she knew Jesus, she went to heaven too. One time, I will say this. I had a friend working a funeral. He was over at the cemetery in Ontario, and I think there was a priest that was officiating, a Catholic priest, and he paused and let people say a few words. There was some drunk, guy was half drunk in the crowd. He was a drunk or she was a drunk and a prostitute. I'm glad she's dead. That's what the guy said. And the minister said, "Is there anyone else that has something to say?" I was working a funeral one time, and the man that died, he and his wife had been married over 60 years. They had 14 children, and 35, 45 grandchildren, a couple dozen great-grandchildren. They'd been married a long time, a big family. And I was expecting our building to be full, just with family members. And there was a total of 14 people at the funeral. And that included me and another co-worker and the minister. So, 11 people total. And the widow was sitting there in the front row with a handful of relatives. And the minister is reading about the man's life. And he says, "I see Dad like to play cards. See, he liked to play rummy. Did he ever cheat?" And the old woman, the wife, in the front row, "He cheated on me." Just like that. If I wasn't there, if I hadn't witnessed it, I wouldn't believe it. But I was there, and I can tell you, it happened. And so the minister says, "Well, does anyone else have some comments?" Let's move on to the next point. But as a general rule, nobody ever wants to talk about the sins of men. They want to talk about somehow they made it in. They never went to church, didn't talk about God, didn't know Jesus, never read their Bible, didn't profess to know Jesus Christ, but once they died, we know they're in heaven now. That's the strangest business. You ask them in life, "Do you know where you're going to?" "No, I don't believe anyone can know, and I don't want to talk about it. It's a private matter between me and God. I don't want to talk about it." And then they die, and everyone talks about them. Well, we know she's in heaven now, and he's an angel now, and we know they're with God now. But when you ask them, they didn't know. But somehow after they die, everybody else knows. I don't know how that works, but it turns out that way. Anyway, you cannot judge. Someone that's a prating fool gets himself into trouble by his own mouth. And God sets a contrast repeatedly between someone with wisdom and someone who's a fool in the book of Proverbs. All right, let's bow for prayer. We'll conclude this.